Welcome. Welcome to the University of Wisconsin, Marathon County. We are a community-supported campus, a partnership between the UW and Marathon County. And welcome to Wausau, a wonderful small city here in north central Wisconsin. My name is Keith Montgomery. I'm the campus dean at UWMC, and I'd like to acknowledge a colleague from UWSP, Chancellor Bernie Patterson from UW Stevens Point. Welcome, Bernie. Welcome to the conference. Welcome to the James F. and Inga Theatre in the UW Center for Civic Engagement. I wish you a good conference in these 2 days, and I hope you enjoy UWMC and Wausau. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Chris Siermo. Dean Chris Siermo is the Dean of Letters and Sciences at University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and he is going to further introduce the proceedings this evening. Chris?
Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Keith. Welcome, everyone. First, I want to congratulate Dean Montgomery on being the choice for the Northern College's reorganization. He's going to be the new chief executive for the 4 campuses of the colleges in the Northern. I think there's like a 600-mile round trip between Marathon County, Marshfield, Rice Lake, and Marinette. So he's going to be on the road a lot. Let's just say that. But congratulations nonetheless. On behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, UW Marathon County, and the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, which is WIPS, by the way, I want to welcome you to the 20th Conference of the Small City and Regional Community. The Center for the Small City was founded in 1978, actually 1979, on the UW Stevens Point campus. Conference began in March of '78 as an annual event at UWSP and went biennial in 1982. It's been at Stevens Point 14 of the 20 times it's been offered, and the Center for the Small City has always been one of the co-sponsors. The conference is one of the longest running conferences that's not affiliated with a professional organization. Previous venue sponsors have included UW-Madison, University of Louisville, Western Michigan University, Illinois State University, and Wilkes University in Pennsylvania. And themes have always focused on those issues which are important to small communities. Examples would be in economic development, planning and design, poverty and social development, population change, healthcare delivery, and a variety of others having to do with energy. The conference claims small cities as any settlement of fewer than 50,000 citizens, which is the same definition as used by the U.S. Census Bureau. These communities are referred to as micropolitan settlements. This year's conferences focus on public engagement and civic participation, so it's appropriate that we hold it here in the UW Marathon County Center for Civic Engagement in this beautiful facility and around this facility as well. Topics of this year's conference include governance, alternative transportation, successful community engagement models, youth involvement, brownfields development, social media, and many others. And you should have gotten a program when you came in. Presenters include representatives from our faculty and staff, administrators, representatives from government agencies, private firms, and cultural centers. Since joining UW-Stevens Point 6 years ago, I've had the pleasure of working with the co-founders of the Center for the Small City, Bob Walensky, who's Emeritus Professor of Sociology, and Ed Miller, Professor of Political Science. Bob, would you raise your hand to stand up? Back there. And Ed? Ed's down front here in the white shock. And I want to make a note the difference between them. Bob is an emeritus professor and chose to retire before Ed. And so, Bob, you get all the privileges that go with that, including immunity from our budgetary woes of the last few years. I've rarely had the pleasure of working with two more, let's say, dedicated, credentialed, and decorated faculty. Along with their expertise goes a healthy sense of humor, the ability to have fun, work outside the box, and engage their colleagues. It's truly been wonderful to work with Bob and Ed. Don't let it go to your heads at this point, but it has been a wonderful time. I congratulate Bob and Ed on their many years of service to the university. They have a combined 95 years of service to UWSP. Sounds bigger than 100, doesn't it? But it's not. In listening to Glenn Moberg's Route 51 on Wisconsin Public Radio last week, it included our distinguished guests, Harry Boyte and Eric Jordano of WIPS. And it was clear that they have much to say in how small communities are a more fundamental unit of this democracy than we care to believe. And I believe you'll very much appreciate the perspectives of tonight's keynote address. So I hand it over to Eric Jordano of WIPS now to introduce our special guest.
Greetings on behalf of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. We welcome you to tonight's free public event, which also serves as our kickoff to the 20th Annual Conference on the Small City and Regional Community. My name is Eric Jordano, and I direct WIPS. And tonight we're fortunate to have an internationally renowned speaker, Harry Boyte, who will be speaking on the topic, Small Cities, Centers of a Democratic Renaissance. We'd really like to thank our event sponsors, and particularly Ministry Health, Scherer Construction, and the North Central Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission. Now, tonight's forum would not be possible without the hard work of some good people, and Chris praised a few, and so I'll just recognize a couple of additional folks. So Ed and Bob that were already introduced, Deb Dorhorst, Bill Rizzo, Mike Huggins, and Connie Nicolai all served on the planning committee. And we'd also like to thank additional staff members, Alex Sawaya, Justin Bellich, Mariana Jordano, Leo Mua, and Aaron Zitzelberger, along with our interns who are serving as ushers tonight. And we're also grateful for the technical support from our theater technician, Chris Berg. Following our speaker, we're going to have an audience question and answer session. Our staff will circulate in the theater with microphones. Just make sure that when you're responding or asking your question that you speak into the microphone, because we are recording the event. And we ask that you accord our guest and each other the courtesy and respect that we all expect from a public forum dedicated to civil dialogue. At this time, please make sure that your cell phones and electronic devices are silenced. Our forum will end promptly at 8:30 p.m. Now, we live in an active, some would say hypersensitive, political world in which every public and increasingly private act is scrutinized for its deeper political significance and meaning, mostly so we can easily identify friend from foe in order to protect our own while taking our political foes to the woodshed. It is not surprising, then, that public confidence in federal government has reached its nadir since they have been tracking these things, or why public participation in traditional political activities among young people is at its lowest level in 40 years. People feel tired, they feel fed up, disenfranchised, and it's remarkably true across both sides of the aisle. But there is some good news. Despite this sort of dismal view of the national and at times state political scene, recent studies show that local government is still viewed positively by a strong majority of Americans, around 70%. Hence our theme, reimagining public engagement, civic participation in local governance, which is timely and relevant. Across the country, local governments remain laboratories of innovation and incubators for civic renewal. So tonight, we're thrilled to have an expert on this topic here with us. Harry Boyte is a senior fellow at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. He also serves as senior scholar in public work philosophy at the Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship at Augsburg College, which he helped found this center. He was an architect of the college's Center for Democracy and Citizenship, including its public work approach to civic engagement and democracy. His work with foundations and educational and citizen organizations in the U.S. and abroad is focused on community development, citizen education, and civic renewal. The author of 9 books on citizenship, democracy, and community organizing, his extensive writings have appeared in the New York Times, Perspectives on Politics, the Kettering Review, and the Wall Street Journal. Most recently, he was on Wisconsin Public Radio in preparation for this conference. And then many people would be interested to know that in the 1960s, he worked for the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. as a field secretary with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We are very privileged to have with us Harry Boyte. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good evening. So now y'all have a lot better color than we do in Minnesota. I drove over from Minnesota. Water would be great. Yeah.
It's not beer, it's more.
Well, I probably shouldn't have beer until I finish this talk. Anyway, the further I got from Minnesota, the brighter the colors. I'm not sure what that means. But it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really interested in this topic. I want to thank Eric and Deb and Connie and the staff of the Wisconsin Institute of Public Policy and Service. I also want to thank Keith Montgomery, Dean Montgomery, and Bill Riso at supper for filling me in. So Montgomery was telling me that something like a third of the school children in Wausau now are Hmong, which is a really striking demographic shift. And we see the same kind of shift in Minnesota, especially in the Twin Cities, where more than half of the students are minority students, giving a new twist to the term minority. And something like 100 languages are spoken in the public school system. So this is a time of dramatic change. So my topic may seem quixotic. Small cities, centers of a democratic renaissance. It needs to be unpacked a bit. What do I mean by democratic? Why? I would say my overall argument tonight is this. We've gone far down the track in American society of substituting relational cultures with informational cultures. And the trends towards big data, predictive technologies, smart machines, massive online education, all have their place, but unless they're contextualized by a deep and revitalized sense of relationships, and I mean not only personal relationships, but as I'll describe, public and political relationships, we're going to be in deep trouble. We're going to be in a society that's more and more fragmented, impersonal, depersonalized, rancorous, bitterly divided. And small cities are sites of the democratic renaissance in potential. It's going to take a lot of work. I'm not saying it's going to happen automatically. Because in small cities, as Eric's figures on people's trust in local government shows, there's still a stronger sense of relationships. Smaller cities are places where you know people, and you don't feel anonymous, and you don't feel lost as much. Not that everything is hunky-dory. So I'm going to start out by a bit on how democracy is in jeopardy, not only in the United States, but around the world, but also connected to that, how the understanding of democracy has radically shrunk. We have seen a shrinkage in the way, in public parlance, in the media, even in academic literature, in the political process, people talk and think about democracy. Then I want to mention some resources we have to draw on, historically in Wisconsin and other states, but mainly I'm going to talk about 5 lessons for democratic revitalization and civic engagement. And the sources here are 3. One, a project I directed with the White House Domestic Policy Council and the Clinton administration, looking at why the gap between citizens and government, what's gone on. And we interviewed hundreds of people in federal agencies, I made a presentation at Camp David before the State of the Union in 1995, and Clinton, some of you may recall, built his speech actually around the idea of reconnecting citizens and government, and the idea that citizens are the foundation of democracy, not a common thing for presidents to say. So that's the first. Secondly, over the last 25 years, we've been involved in what could be called action research partnerships or living partnerships in the world. When the Humphrey Institute asked me to come and create a project on democracy in 1987, I didn't want that to be something academic and detached. in traditional ways, although we wanted to create high-level theory, but out of grounded work and collaboration. So we've worked around the problem of democracy becoming more and more a spectator sport, something people think is voting and something people think they get things from, not democracy as a way of life which all of us do in every environment. So that's the big shift. But this has meant in practice a youth initiative called Public Achievement. Delighted that Mike Huggins can be here. He's been a pioneer in adapting that to local county government in Eau Claire, adults. But the Public Achievement is an initiative that's now in 23 countries in which young people do democracy projects, public work projects, where they take a problem, they learn how to work effectively in their local environment. They work on issues that they choose, and they narrow them down. They work in teams, they're coached, they learn a vocabulary of civic and political concepts. That's been very effective. I'll come back to that. And then also other partnerships, like with Hmong, and most recently East Asian and East African and Latin immigrants into the Twin Cities in something called the Jane Addams School for Democracy. And then finally, over time, we worked especially on revitalizing the democratic purposes of education. Now that's easy to say, but the fact is the purposes of education are rarely discussed. And I mean here both K-12 and higher education. We did a national deliberation with several thousand people across the country in partnership with the Kettering Foundation and the National Issues Forums about what is the purpose of higher education. And people looked at different options and talked about them. But the really striking thing to me in that, it's called Shaping Our Future. It's been over the last 3 years. The striking thing about that was again and again, people said, you know, this has really been a great conversation. I've just never actually heard people talk about the question. What is the purpose of education? So that's a telling silence. And then finally, we did a project with the National Conference on Citizenship, which is a congressionally mandated citizenship body. Looking at, this is one of the two reports, in 2009 and 2010, we looked at Minnesota and then the Twin Cities. And the National Conference has a great deal of census data with measures that measures levels of citizen engagement. And that's a variety of measures. How much you work with your neighbors on a community problem, how often people turn up at a public hearing, what's the voting levels, what's the philanthropic giving levels, informal, like how often do families have meals together, and levels of voluntary activity. And so when you aggregate 40 measures like that, Minnesota is the most civically engaged state, and Wisconsin is pretty high. And Minnesota, the Twin Cities area, Minneapolis and St. Paul, are the most engaged communities in the country. So I'm going to draw, especially in the lessons and the initiatives and the new frontiers, on the lessons of those experiences. Why is it? Because it was not only aggregating data, it was analyzing why is it that Minnesota is such a civically engaged state? Why is the Twin Cities the most engaged metropolitan community? And what are trends that are threatening those dynamics? Because there are certainly some troubling trends as well, like racial disparities in education, which are very high in the Twin Cities. So that's my argument, and my basic point is that small cities, especially when they're in partnership with educational institutions, that's a key partnership that emerges, have enormous potential to be at the leading edge of a democratic revitalization. But just to start, so democracy's in trouble, not only in the United States, but around the world. We're seeing the rise of strongmen. Putin, Modi, Xi in China, Zuma in South Africa, where I live part of the year. You could argue that we have some candidates in the United States presidential campaign who have that bent, elect me and I'll fix it. I'll just tear down the bureaucracies and get it done. That's accompanied by a growing attack on civic organizations. So the Carnegie Endowment study, which studies trends, found that over the last 3 years in 96 countries, there has been legislation seeking to limit, circumscribe, and in some cases outlaw activities of civil society and civic organizations. Nothing like that's happened in the United States, but there are, of course, many troubling trends in the United States. So in the New York Times on September 15th, two scholars from Harvard, Robert Foa and Jaska Munk, wrote about a growing disillusionment with democracy across the globe and in the United States. The two main political parties are more polarized now than they have been at any time since the Civil War. Meanwhile, a Gallup tracking poll shows that trust in the presidency and in the Supreme Court stands at historic lows, while faith in Congress has plummeted so far it is now in single digits, as I'm sure you all know. At the same time, and this is really an important point, a subtle point that the academic literature often misses, because it actually embodies the problem, the definition of democracy in the article in the New York Times, Foa and Munk's article, is shrunken. It's shrunken. They define democracy as an electoral system. This is actually the official definition of the US government. Spread around the world on the website of the US Agency for International Development is this definition of democracy. Democracy refers to a civilian political system in which the legislative and chief executive offices are filled through regular, competitive elections. That's the definition, the official definition. And it's not simply the government definition. Academic literature also shows a really dramatic shrinkage. And no more striking example than the really fine scholar of democracy, Robert Putnam, whose work many of you may know. 3 well-known books. Bowling Alone was probably the most prominent. His first book was called Making Democracy Work, and his last book is called Our Kids. So in Making Democracy Work, in 1993, Putnam assembles a huge amount of research to study what makes for effective regional governments in Italy. And he finds that effective local and regional governments in Italy are directly tied to robust citizen involvement, participation, culture, activity. Just a direct correspondence. In his second book, you will remember Bowling Alone, which was 1997, Putnam argued that levels of voluntary participation in civic organizations had declined, and so Americans were bowling more, but they were bowling alone. That was where the title came from. But he had a number of suggestions for what might be done. His most recent book, now this is a theorist of democracy who began by arguing that democratic government depends on a democratic citizenry. His most recent book, Our Kids, assembles a huge amount of data on growing inequality, which is certainly a pattern we all know. But his definition of democracy has shrunk. So Putnam, in his latest book, defines democracy as equal voice in government. So the idea that democracy and government is dependent on a democratic society has disappeared. If you listen to the campaign speeches of Republicans and Democrats alike, whatever your party preference, the definition of democracy is now the same. And actually quite a shift from Obama's discussion of democracy in 2008. So Bernie Sanders says we have to revitalize our democracy. And he says everyone knows what democracy means. It is one person, one vote. So what's wrong with this picture? Well, it's a dramatic erosion, shrinkage for me. When I was a college student, I was shaped by working for Martin Luther King, as Eric mentioned, in the freedom movement. Something called the Citizenship Education Program. Selma, the movie, how many people have seen Selma? Well, you know, Selma does show the power of more than Martin Luther King. It shows the dignity and the discipline of everyday citizens. But you would get the impression from Selma that the goal of the movement was voter registration. Now, voter registration was an important piece, but nobody I knew in the movement thought the goal of the movement was registration. And the goal of the movement was not simply dismantling segregation. The goal was deepening America as a democratic society. That's what Martin Luther King meant at the end of the letter from a Birmingham jail when he said the movement is bringing the country back to the great wells of democracy that we have forgotten. This was out of the 50s and the suburbanization and the famous debate between Richard Nixon, the vice president, and Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Communist Party in Moscow, where Nixon defined democracy as our ability to purchase various consumer goods in a model kitchen. It was called the kitchen debate. So when King talked about bringing the country back to the great wells of democracy, he was saying it was bringing the country back to an understanding that had been eroded, even though also it was a promise that had never been fulfilled for African Americans in formal political and social terms. But that sense of democracy as a way of life was at the very heart of the genius of American political life. So when Alexis de Tocqueville, the French observer, traveled across the country in the 1830s and wrote the world's most famous travelogue, what was that? Yeah. He didn't define democracy as elections. In fact, what Tocqueville said was that unlike European nations, what was distinctive and amazing to him about America was that citizens took initiative when they saw a problem. They did not wait for government officials to fix it. He gave countless stories after story. He also saw that as a kind of everyday citizen politics where people learned to work together across different lines of partisan conviction. And in many ways, that grew from the experiences of settlers and communities that built a democratic society. The historian Robert Wiebe talks about Americans as developing a sense of portable democracy, by which he meant that settlers built roads, schools, libraries, infrastructure, bridges, town halls, greens like the park here, beautiful park, by the way. And that was seen as the work of the people. It wasn't seen as something delivered to the people. And of course, that definition of democracy is woven into the very constitutional fabric. So distinctive in American political history is the preamble to the Constitution, which declares that we, the people, took action to establish a form of government. It wasn't handed down from antiquity or bequeathed from nobility or kings. It wasn't a favor granted. It was something that we, the people, had created, not an elite. It's a remarkable statement in human history. So in the 20th century, this understanding of democracy as a way of life was inextricably tied to education and higher education. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But schools like Wausau, the Wisconsin system, and K-12 schools were all part of a larger understanding of democracy. In fact, the political philosopher, educational theorist John Dewey, probably the most consequential influential theorist of education in the first half of the 20th century, said that the key influences on the young person are families and educational institutions, and whether those experiences take place in a democratic or undemocratic fashion makes all the difference, have immense consequences for a democratic way of life. So he was defining democracy as a democratic way of life. But the cooperative extension tradition, the tradition that the Wisconsin Institute still continues, the tradition of community-created libraries, a variety of institutions were tied to democracy as a way of life. I'll come back to that in a minute. In 1947, the Truman Commission on Higher Education said that the fundamental purpose of higher education is that it should propagate democratic values and practices. So that was a democratic way of life. It wasn't simply knowledge about how do you vote. So we've seen a real shrinkage. And I'll go into reasons as I also discuss what to do. But the way we think about democracy and citizenship and politics needs a little unpacking, because I think we have, as Martin Luther King mentioned, we've lost a lot of memory around these. So could we get the chart? Yeah. So there's not a single definition of democracy, citizenship, politics. There's different frameworks. And in our work over the years, we've identified 3 different paradigms or frameworks. So the first column, and the top terms are associated with schools of political thought, is what's called liberal political theory, but that doesn't mean it's not like liberal conservative. It's more, the center of the action is government. It's a state-centered understanding. So what kind of civic education is associated with that? Well, civics. What happens in government? How a bill becomes law. Who are the Supreme Court justices? The citizen is a voter and also a person who has legal rights as a member of a legally constituted body. The highest act of citizenship is voting. Has anyone here seen the citizenship test for naturalization? So the citizenship test asks true or false questions. If you answer wrongly, you miss if you answer too wrongly, you don't get to be a citizen. So the citizenship test asks, what is the most important right? And what do you think the answer is? The right answer? No? Vote. It failed. No, if you don't say voting, you're wrong. The most important right is voting. So that's a government-centered definition of democracy and citizenship. You know, Russia had 96% of the population voting under communism, so it's a little hard to say that you get a democratic society through voting. Politics is partisan. It's us versus them. And we can go down. Power is power over resources, methods of change or protest, elections, advocacy. And local government's civic role is service delivery. So the problem is that that is a very individualizing view of citizenship and democracy. And it also leads most people in this role as largely spectators. It's a spectator sport. So in recent years, second approach in theoretical terms, it's called communitarianism. Now this is something interesting. Do you know that both Bill Clinton and George Bush, George W., declared themselves as communitarians? For all their differences. They identified with the communitarian citizenship. In this view, the world of associations and voluntary activity are important parts of democracy. The model citizen is a volunteer. Citizenship is involvement in communities. Politics is usually ignored, except in politics itself when you have a ferocious politics, but there's this big separation between politics, the political system, and citizenship. Power is more relational. And this is interesting. The reason we have a service learning movement in America, both higher education and K-12, is because of this communitarian theoretical frame. People like Robert Bella in the 80s and others started arguing that American life was very individualist. Young people were learning me first and to say what's my rights, but they weren't learning to think about relationships, responsibility to others. So the whole service movement is a movement that came consciously out of this framework to inculcate values of responsibility, care for others, relationships. And I would say facilitation of dialogues. Now, neither of these are wrong, I wouldn't say, but from our perspective, there's a whole another way of thinking about democracy, citizenship, politics that's left out of these. And that's what we call a work-centered or agency understanding of democracy. Now here, this is what I learned in the freedom movement. When people talked about democracy as a way of life, people like Vincent Harding or my boss in the citizenship schools, Dorothy Cotten, said, how do people who feel powerless, who feel victimized, who feel oppressed, how do they shift from a victim mentality to feeling like they are agents of change? Dorothy Cotten has written a wonderful book about the citizenship education program, which was an invisible foundation of the whole movement. 8,000 people were trained in creating citizenship schools at a training center in Georgia from 1961 to 1968, and went back and created citizenship schools in their communities, which were basically kind of community organizing 101. So it wasn't only about segregation, it was also about how you get a sewage system in your neighborhood, or how do you work with the local government, find out information. But it's the idea of the third column is citizens are empowered agents of change. They're the foundations. In fact, the song we used to sing was, "We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Nobody else is going to rescue us. We are the ones we've been waiting for." So that suggests the sense of people as agents of their own lives and working together. I'll come back to the citizen professional. But citizenship is not simply off-hours activity, it's actually citizenship through their work. Politics is not only electoral politics, so this doesn't deny the relevance or the existence of the other frameworks, but there's a third kind of politics which are left out of the first two columns, which was what Alexis de Tocqueville talked about when he looked at America. He said, the amazing thing about American society is that there's this different kind of politics. Not only party politics, he didn't call it citizen politics, he called it everyday problem-solving politics. But it's people learning how to work with people they really disagree with and they dislike. Citizen politics. Politics that's owned and revolves around citizens, not around parties, not around elections, not around how we disagree, but actually politics in the older Greek sense comes out of the tradition of thinking about politics as a horizontal activity among citizens who learn how to engage other people who are different. The meaning of politics for more than 2,000 years was not party politics, but it was learning how to engage people who were different. That's what we've lost, but the citizen politics is a way to get that back. And then I would say power is much more multidimensional than simply its control of resources. It's power to create, it's power of imagination and ideas, it's power of traditions and stories. I'll come back to this. Methods of change involve all these, but also public work, working together to create and build and solve problems. And government's role, importantly, adds to the service delivery or facilitation the idea of catalyzing public work. So a great example would be the traditions of the Roosevelt New Deal, something like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which enlisted over 3 million young men, poor young men, in building the nation's park system and doing soil erosion and any other kinds of work. So this is a different framework for thinking about democracy as a way of life. What is politics? What is citizenship? Now, it's not a pipe dream. First of all, it's deep in our history. And secondly, you can see examples re-emerging. So that's what I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about 5 different areas of work or initiatives where a sense of democracy as a way of life is being reborn. And you'll see why small cities are natural seedbeds for those. Although it's not a simple thing, it takes work. It takes challenging a lot of the cultural understandings we have today and the ways we organize today. But the first is a recovery of the democratic understanding of education. Now, not to idealize things, but we have had in American history a very different understanding of education. And when we analyzed why Minnesota and the Twin Cities were so civically engaged, it was because of a democratic understanding of education. So what does that mean? Well, it means not only formal institutions of education, but a lot of informal, self-organizing, self-directed learning. So the Chautauqua movement among farmers in the 19th century was a vast movement involving millions of farmers in self-study. Adult education was very strong in the Twin Cities, in the Minnesota, and in Wisconsin. The traditions of libraries that were created by citizens. Libraries were not created by outsiders. They were citizen institutions. They were called arsenals of democracy. The settlement house tradition in the Minneapolis and St. Paul meant that there were 14 settlements, places called settlements, where immigrants coming into the Twin Cities could find welcome, but also could become part of the life of the Twin Cities. And they were welcoming not only in personal terms, but in terms of culture, in terms of interests, in terms of talents. Neighborhood house on the west side of St. Paul, which is where we started our work with the Hmong in reviving this older tradition of settlements, was like the United Nations. It was called the League of Nations. It was full of different immigrants coming in. And they would interact, and they'd get to know each other, and they'd also celebrate their own cultural traditions. The Farmer Labor Association was a tremendous movement of education across the state of Minnesota in the 1930s and 40s. Literally millions of people involved in study clubs and reading circles and lectures. So a lot of that continues, but at the heart of a democratic understanding of education is this premise: that a diverse mix of people from different backgrounds in a demanding educational environment can achieve greatness and excellence that a focus on winnowing out the stars and the success stories cannot achieve. Now, what's at work here? Well, it was the tradition of a land-grant institution like the University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota didn't have admissions tests until 1961. In the 1930s, it was called a democracy college. It was a tradition of City College in New York, the nation's intellectual powerhouse in the 1930s and 40s, which admitted every student who graduated from high school in New York and gave them a free ride. It was free tuition. It was a tradition of community colleges and regional colleges, comprehensives, liberal arts colleges of many kinds, like Augsburg. Augsburg is an institution which still believes in democratic excellence and cooperative interaction, not focused on the stars. But we have shifted in terms of our understanding of education from a democratic understanding to an individualist meritocratic understanding. And this is driven by a number of dynamics. So Lonnie Grenier, the first African-American woman to be a professor of law at Harvard, has just come out with a book called The Tyranny of the Meritocracy. Grenier documents how we've become a testocracy in her terms. We define excellence by scores on tests. Well, what's wrong with that picture? Why is that the measure of excellence? Social contribution, even creative work. But it also increases inequality because it discriminates against those who don't do well on tests, and that is disproportionately minorities, women, and working class kids. So we have built into our educational system a set of values and norms, which I think are at every level, which are individualist and meritocratic, not cooperative and democratic. So that's a huge challenge. It's not that people aren't trying to challenge it, but I'll tell you a story about the challenges of this. So Nancy Cantor was the provost of the University of Michigan, but a product of City College, believed in the old idea of democratic and cooperative excellence. So when she was appointed chancellor of Syracuse, she told what she wanted to see. She wanted Syracuse University, one of the great research universities, to become a democracy university. And this meant a number of specific things. It meant changing admissions policies. She came in 2004. She pushed right away to have admissions admit any student from the city of Syracuse who graduated from high school. And she also worked with businesses to create a coalition of support for students to get, like City College, a free ride for tuition. It meant changing the faculty promotion and tenure so that people got rewards and recognition for what's called public scholarship. Not simply writing to others in their fields. Scholarship that's good, but it has larger audiences and purposes than simply writing to your own discipline. There's a very good book by a collection by Thomas Bender and Carl Shorsky that shows that has leaders in 4 different disciplines in look at the last half of the 20th century: English, political science, economics, and philosophy. In every case, they find the disciplines became more inward-looking, less engaged with the problems of the society. So Cantor was reversing that trend. It also meant the University of Syracuse coming down from the hill. It's on top of a hill, creating partnerships throughout the city, working with other institutions of higher education, a Jesuit college, a community college, a state university, as well as this K-12 system, and many neighborhood development and arts projects. So really, a significant change in a period of 7 years, and very dramatic changes in the demographics of the university student population, from something like 11 to 31% minority students. Huge, huge change. But we're up against challenges here. In 2011, a front page article on the Chronicle of Higher Education came out with the headline, "Syracuse Slide." Now, what do you think that meant? Can you imagine what the slide referred to? Bingo. It had gone from something like 40th to 61st in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Now, it actually was inevitable because the rankings, the U.S. News and World Report rankings, like the Shanghai and the UK rankings globally, disadvantage institutions which were involved in the life of their communities. They reward institutions which have very narrow definitions of scholarship. And they especially disadvantage any institutions which have inclusive admissions policies. So the more exclusive your admissions policies, the higher your rankings. And of course, what's happening? I mean, calling out names. Northeastern University has gamed the system. Used to be a working man's institution. Now they found that if they get a sufficient number of students to apply, that they can reject, their rankings go up. So there's this kind of corrupt system of trying to seduce students into applying so you can reject them. So that's the replacement of a democratic culture and purpose of education with a meritocratic culture. We can fight back. We have coalitions now of presidents and universities and colleges which are looking at what does it mean to revitalize a democratic college, and that's what I'm going to talk about. 4 other themes that are important. But the first is being clear that we're talking about a challenge to the ways of the world, the incentive systems and structures, the testocracy, the ranking systems. We need different ways to measure excellence that are about democracy, not about individualist stardom. Of course, individualist stardom, as public policy people pointed out 100 years ago, guess who that disadvantages the most? Small cities and towns. Because the dominant norm means that if you're supposed to be excellent and talented, get out of there. Leave it behind. Go to somewhere else. So in the first instance, there's a natural alliance between small cities and the movement for democratic education. Secondly, I would say colleges which are on the front lines of democratic revitalization, like small cities, pay attention to their stories. They recover a rich, deep sense of history. One concept of use here is the idea of saga. Every city has a saga. And the more people know that, participate in it, see themselves contributing to it, talk about it, the more alive and democratic and civic that culture is going to be. We found in studying Minnesota, cities and towns and communities that were civically engaged, there was a very strong sense of heritage, history, consciousness of the story of the place. And I would say Minnesota, probably like parts of Wisconsin, still have a very strong overall sense of history. But let me just point out, this is actually about economic benefit as well as democratic purpose. A recent study of what makes for successful downtowns. Finds that the towns that are resilient and flourishing have linked historic preservation to the promotion of heritage tourism. They welcome people into diverse experiences for experiencing authentic place and activities that tell the stories of peoples, cultures, and histories that live in that place. The heritage of most small cities is in their downtowns, unlike many big cities where the heritage buildings have been destroyed. So there's a real resource. While many large cities, this is a study by Michael Boyte, published in Downtown Idea Exchange. But many large cities have decimated their heritage through urban renewal and massive skyscraper projects. Small town downtowns still boast such sites and buildings. And these are the places where buildings have meaning and potential meaning, and where there's a sense of place, where a community's story can be told, its culture is on display, its history is narrated. Now, the interesting thing about this is that communities which revitalize a sense of their history, their story, their narrative, their saga, just like colleges, by the way, also are attractive to newcomers and visitors. And as this article points out, 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every day, and baby boomers are showing strong preference for communities which have a strong sense of place. So the second is the idea of public narrative, saga, history. Thirdly, another thing we found in looking at key factors in civic engagement is vital public spaces and also what we call free spaces. Now, they're somewhat different. So the park that I drove by is a wonderful public space. And Deb was pointing out that there's a green space downtown that people have many festivals. Those are public spaces. Public spaces and care and tending of public spaces is a very important part of democratic engagement. The out-of-the-box initiative of Project for Public Spaces, so let me give you this citation. Project for Public Spaces is the leading group in the world in working with communities and citizens to develop vital public spaces. And they have a project around downtown revitalization. And they find that libraries and many other institutions downtown have potential for diverse mingling. Libraries, for example, can function as community centers, business incubators, town halls, senior and immigrant centers, places for adult education, after-school programs for children and teens. So that mingling, that mix, that public life is really important. There's another dimension. So it's a dimension that Alexis de Tocqueville was observing. We have seen an erosion of places where people of different views and backgrounds who have different ways of looking at the world come together. So I'll give you a story of how much we're in these cultures of gated communities. I was talking to a student group, mostly African-American students, very activist, last week at Minneapolis Community College, about 70 students. And I said, so let me ask you a question. I was talking about the citizen politics I'd learned in the citizenship education program. Because the citizen politics, people, this came out a little bit in the Selma movie where King was having an argument with the young SNCC guys and saying, you can work in communities all forever, but unless you learn how to win support from the majority of Americans, we're not going to get very far. So SCLC had what Bayard Rustin, the great organizer, called a strategy of winning over the middle of the country. But this meant in practical terms a real concern for how not to demonize and stigmatize and write off blocks of the population. So Martin Luther King in 1964 assigned me to organize poor whites. Poor Southern whites. In many communities, there were significant numbers of Ku Klux Klan members. And I asked this student group why that would have been. And they were completely baffled. Because in the ways we see on television and in the news, the way things are framed these days, a community like that, where you have people with clear prejudice, racial prejudice, is just seen as evil. I mean, so kids said, well, maybe they wanted you to spy. Or maybe they thought you could explain the movement better. And then one woman had the answer. She said, King had a sense, and it wasn't only Martin Luther King, it was Dorothy Cotten, my boss in the citizenship schools, as many people, that poor whites are oppressed. They're missed over. Sometimes they cling to a racial identity as a kind of safety boat. But if they develop any sense of agency and power, they might be allies. I did that for 8 years in Durham, North Carolina, and we built a lot of interracial relationships. So if the movement had done that in a consistent way, I think Southern politics would be different today. In fact, Durham politics is definitely different. Much more interracial alliance in Durham. So we call this free spaces. Free spaces where people learn to deal with conflict and tension and difference in constructive ways. And I want to hold up here Mike Huggins' work with Clear Vision in Eau Claire. Local government is creating what we would call free spaces where people learn to work together across differences on community projects and problem solving. They learn the skills. This takes skills. This takes disciplines, right? It's not just something that people are born knowing how to do. You're born thinking that if people are unlike you, if they disagree with you, then there's something wrong with them. So it takes a discipline, takes a set of skills to understand other people are not evil because they disagree, or because they have a different story, they have a different background. Our Public Achievement Initiative, which is now in hundreds of communities in 23 countries, is based on young people learning a different kind of politics, citizen politics. And we've seen again and again that when young people learn that, it unlocks a kind of passion and energy and capacity. So we need places to teach citizen politics. This is not going to come from Washington. In fact, I just wrote a blog today for Education Week about an experience I had with the White House after the shootings in Newtown in Sandy Hook shootings in Newtown in 2012. So the White House called a meeting. What could citizens do beyond fighting over gun laws? And we surveyed, about 10 people came together. We surveyed a lot of the civic world. We found a lot of things people could do. It would be across partisan lines. From community conversations about what to do about guns, to anti-bullying programs that are peer-led, to a very innovative program from New Zealand, a kind of CPR for mental health. How do you recognize isolated kids and intervene in constructive ways and connect them with support? Many ideas. The Domestic Policy Council and Joe Biden's staff, who had organized this meeting, said these are great. And then what they said? Unfortunately, we couldn't float any of these in Washington because any idea we proposed would be seen as a partisan ploy. So that's the culture we're dealing with in Washington. Now, in local levels, there's potential for getting beyond that, at least to some extent. So I think it's why the Eau Claire experience of clear vision is really so important. Okay, fourth, I want to finish up so we have time to discuss. We need institutions which again see themselves as parts of places, not outside studying places, or not even simply partners with places. So this is the great tradition of land grants. Lotus Kaufman, the president of the University of Minnesota in the 1930s, said the university is down in the trenches with the population. There are some in the university who would have us climb up on a Mount Olympus far from the population, but not as long as I'm here. He also said, the University of Minnesota is not the property of those at the University of Minnesota. It expresses the sole force of the people of the state and is the guardian of democracy. So he had a deep sense that the University of Minnesota belonged to the people of the state. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this has eroded as we've seen a more meritocratic, individualist educational culture, but it's also eroded because of the culture of academic research, which has become more detached. So our center and the chair of the political science department, Ed Fogelman, Ed and I interviewed 45 faculty who had been at the University of Minnesota for several decades, senior faculty, some very distinguished in their fields. In virtually every case, they lamented the fact that the culture of research had become more detached, and the university's relations with the citizens had become more detached. Now, I know the University of Minnesota, like Madison, is a research institution, a research one, but it trickles down. The culture of detachment trickles down. It affects professionals of every kind. It's a shift from what we call civic professional to disciplinary professional. I'll come back to that. But it affects every institution. So we worked with the provost because we found all this discontent. We eventually came up against the rankings like Nancy Cantor had. By the way, what happened after the Syracuse slide, just a back story. There was tremendous support for Cantor after that article came out. But the trustees appointed a commission to study this slide, so-called slide in the rankings. So she left. She said, I'm not going to be personalized. So she's at Rutgers, which is actually Rutgers Newark, which is a very diverse institution, and they've developed a very collaborative, creative process of thinking about building relations with the city of Newark. We came up against the rankings. But for 2 years, we had very widespread discussions at the U and in the city and in the state, the Twin Cities and the state, about what would it be like to revive the democracy mission of the University of Minnesota, the identity of a democracy college. And we had many interesting conversations, one with state legislators. Now, state legislators said a couple of things that were really striking. First of all, they all said the University of Minnesota has become more distant from this people. The Republicans said that we think it's become arrogant. So does that remind you of some politicians over on this side? But the Democrat who was the chair of the Senate Finance Committee for Higher Education, Steve Kelly, said this. He said, in our view, my view, the University of Minnesota, when it talks about public engagement, means mainly public relations. I said, I don't have anything against public relations. I use it in my campaigns. But public relations are not the same thing as public relationships. And the problem with the University of Minnesota, the political problem, this was a Democrat who was seen as a leading champion of the University of Minnesota. The political problem of the University of Minnesota is that you've lost a hell of a lot of public relationships over the last generation. So this is also a cautionary note for those who would centralize extension, for example, or who would lose the roots of community activity and resources in the life of places. But the interesting thing is that the legislators didn't only want to talk about the university, they wanted to talk about themselves. They said, you know, we've seen politics become narrowly professionalized, so we've lost the idea of citizen politician. And I heard that again and again as we talked to different groups. So business in the Twin Cities and educators and nonprofit leaders all said we've lost a sense of being citizens and our institutions as being part of the place. Some of the largest business leaders in the Twin Cities and head of the Minnesota Business Partnership said, you know, we've come to see ourselves as outside the life of communities. We used to have a tradition of 10% of profits going back to the Twin Cities. So there's a movement in higher education, and I think it can be paralleled by small cities, to think of institutions and ask institutions, how are they parts of places? And in education, it means a lot of things. It means thinking about all the resources. $1 trillion every year are in higher education. So think of those resources as resources for local development. But hospitals and businesses can also be asked and challenged to think about their contributions as citizens of places. And so finally, I want to lift up the idea of the citizen professional. In Minnesota, the civic engagement tradition involved people in work seeing themselves as citizens. In fact, a really dramatic example at the Humphrey Institute. Hubert Humphrey, vice president, senator, ran for president, said he learned everything he knew about politics from his father's drugstore in Dolan, South Dakota, where his father was one of 6 Democrats in a town of 600 Republicans. But his father's life work, this was not a volunteer, this was his life work as a druggist in Dolan, was to make that drugstore the civic heart of that town. Center for discussion and projects and music and art and a lending library for the town. Humphrey said he learned everything about politics from that drugstore. There were a lot of Humphrey drugstores. And they depended on people like Humphrey's father, who were citizen business people, or citizen teachers, or citizen lawyers, or citizen politicians. And we've really seen an erosion of that identity. So just a little story. After this White House meeting, and I had done a letter in the New York Times that argued, they'd used as a reader forum, argued what else could people do around gun violence, a topical question this week, rather than debate gun laws. I mean, that's one piece of it, but that's only a little piece of it. It's not going to solve the problem. We could have all sorts of gun laws. We have millions of guns, I think something like 200 million guns floating around the society. And anyway, it doesn't solve the problem of isolated young men who are deranged and angry and feel overwhelmed and victimized, and the violent culture on the video games and all sorts of things. So this town, Falcon Heights, wanted to have a town meeting about what citizens could do about gun violence. And about 30 people were there. We went around. This was 2 other staff people in the Center for Democracy and Citizenship and myself. We asked everybody who they were, what they did, where they came from. There were business people, there was teachers and a principal, there was social service agencies, there was a professor from the University of Minnesota, there was the mayor and the city manager and the sheriff or the police chief. And we went around, and finally we got to 2 elderly residents, and they said, we really care about this issue, but we're sorry there are only 2 citizens here. So we waited. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nobody challenged their working definition of citizen as a volunteer. That's how we've come to think about citizen. Unless you vote or you volunteer. So then we had a great discussion, which was like an intimation of possibility, of what it would be like, what kind of power would there be in Falcon Heights if people saw themselves as citizens through their work, and their work as civic sites, the school, the businesses, the social service agency. The police chief really got into it. The city manager. People wanted to talk about it. But of course, the challenge is it's not the way people are trained. They're not trained to think of themselves as citizens through their work. But our experience, and I want to just conclude with this, is that there is a tremendous appetite among young people for thinking in this way. We moved our center over to Augsburg in significant measure because we thought faculty might have more freedom to experiment with things like citizen teacher and citizen nurse, and that's been dramatically true. And students are charged up like I don't think I've seen students before about the idea of being, so a citizen professional in this case, say the teacher is a nurse, is someone who simply doesn't get a job, but changes a system. So how can you be a change agent as a teacher? How can you bring back a sense of connection to the community that may have been lost? How do you develop a different value system than simply individual hyperachievement? And all the students in special ed, 30 students a year, are really enthusiastic about this because special ed is an example of everything wrong with the individualized, meritocratic, technocratic, expert-driven educational system because it tries to fix kids who don't want to be fixed, stigmatizes kids, labels them as failures. 80% of kids in special education in high school in the Twin Cities end up in jail at some point in their lives. So obviously the system needs changing, but adapting the public achievement model, working with kids to become effective agents of change, the younger kids, they really see hope. They're filled with hope. And I would lift up a couple of other examples. I would say Huggins is an example of a citizen city manager who really believed in working with citizens on the problems of the community. I just met with a guy, Craig Waldron, who was the city manager of Oakdale, Minnesota. Now, he did something simple, but it's something also very pioneering. He created a support system for city employees. He had to go through some vetting process. City employees to get support, credit, as part of their work lives to be involved in community activities, because he thought it would be an important way of connecting the city government with the community. By the way, that's also an innovation in some of the colleges and universities that are thinking about how to become democracy colleges again. So Denison University, Adam Weinberg, the president, is creating a support mechanism for the janitors and other people in the staff to actually work with community groups as part of their work. Again, you have to figure it out, but it's like a shift from thinking of yourself as an ivory tower or an isolated city government to being part of a community. I would call that citizen profession. So let me just conclude by saying, reminding us, in the words of Walt Whitman, democracy is a great word whose future remains, his history remains unwritten. It's the great inspiring dream of American society. It's what animated millions of people in Minnesota and Wisconsin and other states. In fact, one of the striking things, and we studied a lot of immigrant patterns, immigrants came from Scandinavia and Germany and Scotland and Mexico and up from the South, African Americans, to Minnesota because they felt it was a democratic and egalitarian culture compared to what they had left. That was what, again and again, people said in their letters. So we have a very rich history to build on. I'm convinced that cities, small cities, that take up these approaches, experiment and innovate and challenge and change cultures, can be pioneers in a great democratic renaissance. There's immense hunger for that in our society and around the world. That's why people are voting for strongmen, because they don't know what else to do. And I would say, in the words of Martin Luther King, we face around democracy, as we once did around segregation, the fierce urgency of now. Okay, well, we have some time for discussion and argument, and debate.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm Gavin Luter with Wisconsin Campus Compact. I talk to presidents a lot, and presidents talk to me of universities, not presidents of countries, presidents of universities who say, I want to do more. What exactly can I do to make my university kind of a community responsive institution? I put it in all my speeches. I have great service learning programs, but what can I really do? And I figure I don't always have great answers, so I'm going to ask kind of the expert here. And I know there's at least one president of our member institutions here. So what can a president do to make their university a more community responsive university?
Well, first of all, I think as we've had conversations with Campus Compact, there's a next stage of the engagement movement, which is, it's not simply about engagement, that's important, but it's also about reviving a big understanding of democracy. So there's an intellectual role that campuses should play. I mean, anytime someone like Putnam, I mean, a great guy, I know him, says democracy means voice in government, you say, what? Excuse me. I mean, there's a whole literature, there's a vast tradition, there's an immensity of experience to draw on that says democracy is a way of life, not simply elections. So I think there's an intellectual role that really can be an extremely important role. But also, I would just point to these 5 areas that I mentioned. And we're developing a template, actually. We have a draft I can send you. Then we've been talking to Seligson about it and how Campus Compact might use it. But it's basically looking at these as areas of work. There are areas of work for small cities. There are also areas of work for colleges and universities. In fact, I would say there's really interesting parallels as well as differences between colleges and small cities. So, public narrative, a different understanding of purpose, which is about democratic excellence and democratic purpose, not individual achievement. So we've come to have higher education defined as a private good, largely, not a public good. But to say public good is too narrow. It's really about building a society. So the narrative is really important. The third point is free spaces and public spaces on campuses where people and students learn a different kind of politics, learn how to work with people who are different. What Mike Huggins did with Eau Claire and citizens supporting citizen projects. Adam Weinberg did what at Colgan and is now doing at Denison. How can residence halls be places to learn that kind of politics, for example? How can classrooms become free spaces where, now that takes some work on the part of faculty, but where you learn how to deal with debate and discussion and deliberation and tension and conflict, and students have a role in helping to organize the class. Third point is this idea of institutions moving from partners with places to being part of places, citizens of places. So they're the anchor institution concept and the stewardship of place concept. And Nancy Cantor's term, citizens of a place, they're all relevant. And then finally, the point is, and in many ways this is the least discussed, but it's really the most critical, I think. Unless we see ourselves as preparing citizen professionals, leaders who are citizens, not off hours, but as part of their core life work, we're not going to see a democracy. That should be a tremendously central mission of institutions. So that's going to take work. You've got to find places to experiment and work with it. But the idea of citizen professional, citizen teacher, citizen business person, citizen nurse, citizen IT specialist, citizen scientist, those are really cutting edge. So I would say those are 4 areas. 5 areas. Yeah.
Well, I'm a student at Stevens Point,
You,
and one thing I realized when I'm trying to speaking a second language towards us. And I'm kind of curious, every time when we have an idea, we've been told someone else is doing it, and sometimes it turns us off. Instead of saying, oh, this group's doing, how can you contact these people, join them, increase their ranks? And ultimately, like coming to here today, I was told by a professor, and that's the only reason I heard about it. And when I heard he says he's using radio, pamphlets, I was like, this is foreign stuff. We don't use that. We don't pay attention to that. So how are we supposed to know about you guys if you're using stuff that we don't use anymore?
Let me go to your first point. I think the key to developing power and agency is to have experiences which give opportunities for power and agency. So I think a real challenge for the professoriate is to encourage interests, stories, experiences to appreciate. In fact, another way to talk about this democratic excellence thing is we need to shift from imagining students should be college ready to see colleges as becoming student ready. And by that I mean, and this is what I learned in the citizenship education program. It's not like impossible. It's a Scandinavian folk school tradition. It's Berea. It's a lot of institutions that used to have more of this culture. But how do colleges develop a culture of being receptive to who students are? As unique individuals who have talents, who have histories, who have interests, and cultivate those. That's what I would say is a democratic education. And that's going to take a lot of change. But it can be done. And there are particular ways that you can begin on a kind of small scale. So one practice, it's a variant of this narrative idea, is a practice called public narrative. And at Augsburg this year, all the students coming in are learning how to tell their public narrative. So public narrative is a concept that came out of the Obama campaign in 2008, developed by Marshall Gantz, who had been a community organizer for 30 years and then went back to Harvard and finished. But he observed that people were inspired by the stories, and their own stories, but if they learned how to claim them and name them, were real sources of power. So public narrative idea is learning how to name what experiences you've had that are really pivotal, just not like a whole laundry list, but several, 2 or 3. But then what decisions you made about that, and how that ties you to the story of us, where you are now, who you're working with. So it's a collective story, and then the story of us, and the story of now is why it's relevant. So that's very powerful. You see that all the time. When students learn to do public narrative, they begin to even name their own experience in a different way. But I would say that the overall concept is moving to campuses campus culture is becoming more student ready and less imagining students are going to fit into pre-existing norms.
Harry, what's your worst case scenario if we continue on the trend that we're on now?
I don't think this election, but I think in a few, we're going to see a real dictatorial president. We're also going to see very bitter, more and more bitter, rancorous divisions. You know, I mean, I think you can already see it. I mean, I was really struck last week by how, I mean, students kind of got into it when I asked them why the king assigned me to organize a per-white community. But it's just like, they look completely astonished. Because we have a culture, a public culture, which is so built on finding blame, who's wrong, who can we demonize, who can we attack, who can we hate. I mean, that's what people see. It's all over mainstream politics. So it's a real challenge. And I don't think you can simply do it at the level of calling for civility. You've got to actually have people learning experiences of working with people they disagree with, understanding that they're not evil doers because they have a different way of looking at the world. People on different sides of the gun control issue, for example. I mean, there are a lot of things you could find common ground on around violence if you worked on it. But I think if we don't do that, if we don't have a democratic renaissance, we're going to see more and more balkanization. And we're also going to see more and more feelings of powerlessness, because they go together. People feel very powerless these days. You look at all the measures of people's sense of efficacy, and they're going down. But I would also say, connected to that, and connected to the balkanization, we're going to be a more and more lonely society. Isolated. That's why small cities are really important as a kind of front line, a place to push back against those things, because those trends. You know, the average number of strong relationships that average American has dropped by 1/3 in the last generation. People are more isolated across the board. Not everybody, of course, but I mean if you just aggregate. And I think technology, while it can be a great boon, can also be a distraction. You don't have friends on Facebook, I would argue. You have friends, and then you might be able to communicate them with on Facebook. I mean, maybe in rare occasions, but friends are in-depth, relational, spending time together, FaceTime. So I think and you know who's really brilliant on this? Let me just make a pitch. So Pope Francis's climate encyclical names this problem as the development of a way of looking, a kind of technocratic paradigm which comes at things from the outside, that seeks to control other people and objects from an external advantage. Well, that's clearly connected to the way we developed in our education, kind of distanced, detached, so-called objective culture. The encyclical is really a strong statement on that. In fact, he says that's the deepest problem in the world. Replacing relational cultures with informational approaches. So big data is not going to save us. And the more we imagine it is, the worse we're going to be. That's what I learned.
Is one part of the solution re-examining professional legislatures and Congresses?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I mean, how do we return to a citizen profession or citizen politician? That's a great question. I think it's a question worth posing. I do know you can kind of see whether a politician has some relational interests and skills or whether they're just trying to. So, I mean, I saw this in the White House. One of the I'm not such a fan of Bill Clinton, because I think he's very opportunist in a lot of ways. But he is profoundly relational. He likes people, he engages people, he understands people, he listens very well. He was very rare breed in the White House. But most people talk like computer printouts. They just talk in abstractions. They don't talk about concrete stories. So you can identify ingredients of a citizen politician. And I would say the foundation ingredient is like a citizen professional. It's someone who's relational.
Can I just address one possible piece here too that we maybe haven't addressed? And that's the geopolitics on a macro scale and the political economy on a macro scale. That has been changing the world over the last 30, 40 years, which and is producing in the process profound individualizing social and economic and political forces. So while we're really interested in refurbishing democracy at all levels, we have powerful institutions, global institutions, including corporations, that are exporting jobs, and we have austerity measures to balance budgets because corporations aren't paying their taxes. And so we have a lot of big movement, which are making us take care of me and my house, me and my house. And there are some nasty people out there who, me and my house, but my house is falling apart, and I've been labeled as one of the 47% of the takers, and so they're going to write new laws to make sure that I don't take anymore. So I gather, Harry, you believe that we can overcome all these big movements and still in the process keep our eye on the ball and refurbish democracy at the local level.
Well, I don't think we'd ignore anything. I certainly agree, and I would add to your centralization of economic power the devastation of a kind of a consumer culture, the trivialization, the commodification of human beings, the kind of market ways of thinking that take over in schools and redefine students as customers, and condescend and also treat people in very narrow ways. So, and I think the centralization of economic wealth and power is an enormous problem. But I'm not given by personality or strategy to just lamenting problems. So the question is, how do you, so in a concrete way, and I did reference it, but I didn't go into it in detail, how do you re-embed or reconnect, and what are strategies and policies and approaches that can do this, businesses in the life of communities, for example? One thing we found, and this was even among big business leaders in the Twin Cities, was this terrible set. I mean, they said, you know, we don't think of ourselves as citizens of the Twin Cities. All the mergers and global concentrations, in fact, businesses often move us around quickly, so we won't get roots in communities. But unless we can fight that trend, and higher education has a role here. After all, the economic meltdown in 2008 was caused by, you know, graduates of our institutions. And people develop their conceptual frameworks and their sense of what's important out of their formative leadership experiences in our institutions. So I'm saying, what can we do? And I was listing a short list of 5 areas to address these large problems of, and I think on another level, you can look at the economic system as like other systems, K-12, professional sports, higher education. It's like they've become unanchored in the life of places and communities and civic culture. So we need a lot of ways to re-anchor institutions of many kinds in the civic culture. But I appreciate your question. I think it's important. I don't disagree with it. Okay, I think Eric was supposed to finish, right?